Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and especially for a computer scientist to be speaking in front of lots of behavioral scientists. I'm fascinated by behavioral science, and I think that computer scientists need to pay more attention and do things more properly than they do at the moment. But I'm lucky because I have great collaborators like Azim sitting here who can teach me. And I've learned a lot from them. So I'm based at the MIT Media Lab, and I'm very interested in the psychology of technology. And I'm particularly fascinated by this question of autonomous cars and ethics, in particular because the enormous benefits that are promised by this technology. So not only is the technology promising to be more convenient, more comfortable, much more efficient. We can waste much less time. And actually, commuting seems to be one of the major causes of distress in our lives. And I used to commute a lot in the past. But also safety. It seems to be something that is a no-brainer. That we should definitely accelerate the move towards autonomous vehicles as soon as possible in order to eliminate this incredible travesty. Basically, the lifetime odds of dying from a car accident is more than 1%. The lifetime odds of dying from a plane crash is 1 in 100,000. So, 3 orders of magnitude. So, I think that's kind of scary. And autonomous cars promise to eliminate most of those because they're due to human error, because they're faster, they can reassess situations much better than a human being can, and so on. Yet, there are psychological roadblocks, not just technical roadblocks and legal roadblocks to the adoption of this safer technology. And together with Azim and with Jean-François Bonnefond, we wrote recently a commentary in which we tried to classify the major psychological barriers, or roadblocks as I call them. And we think that there are kind of at least 3 classes. One of them is the ethical and the social dilemmas. Or let's say fear of decision-making made by machines. Also, risk heuristics and algorithm aversion. The idea, the way that humans reason about risk may, as we know, is not always rational. Or let's say this may be caused by the fear of incompetence. And finally, the opacity of the mind of the machine, and why it's doing what it's doing. We don't really understand the theory of the machine mind and how it shapes people's willingness to trust the technology. And today I'll focus on the first one, but I think these are all very interesting avenues of research. Now, we have to start with the thinking about the ethical dilemmas, or how would cars behave in a morally charged situation. We cannot really avoid talking about the trolley problem. And the trolley problem is, I'm sure most of you know, is a situation in which a runaway trolley is going to kill 5 people or 10 people on a track, but then you can control, you have access to a switch. You cannot stop the trolley, but you can switch it to a different path or a different track, in which case it would kill 1 person. And most people say, I would do that. Now, it looks something similar. We have something similar in the case of autonomous vehicles. A car maybe has lost control of its brakes or experienced some kind of malfunction and is going to kill a number of pedestrians, but it's able to swerve and kill 1 bystander. Should the car do this? And this is very, very equivalent, I would say, to the trolley problem situation. But I think there's a novelty here, which is that the person being sacrificed could be the person in the car. And I think that adds a new dimension to it, because ultimately these things are going to be purchased by people. So their behavior will shape these decisions. So first, I wanted to talk about some of the objections that have been raised to the use of the trolley problem paradigm in thinking about machine ethics and the ethics of driverless cars. And I don't want to spend too long on it, but I think it's important to highlight a couple of major things. So people have said, well, this is too simple, it's rare, it's never going to happen, it's not technically feasible. It's also too early to worry about it. We'll worry about it later once the cars actually exist. And it scares people away. And I think that's kind of a serious problem, if we're scaring people away by virtue of doing this kind of research. So let me quickly just address these first three collectively, the fact that, that it's too simple or astronomically rare. And I'm going to go all the way. As a computer scientist, this was kind of a powerful thing coming from one of the heroes of the field. So Rodney Brooks is the founder of iRobot, created the Roomba. He is one of the the people who've influenced the field of robotics significantly. He was faculty at MIT before he became emeritus recently. And he wrote recently a blog post in which he called the whole thing pure mental masturbation. And it's a non-existing and irrelevant problem, right? And I think that in some ways he's right, but I think in some ways he's wrong because he's missing the point that the trolley problem is not a literal scenario that would be faced. It's a stylized scenario, right, that captures something real. And to give you an idea of what this real thing might look like, I stole these from Azim. Let's think of a situation in which there's a truck, you're in the car, and a large truck passes on your right. Then you have to make a decision. And these are decisions we make all the time, almost instinctively and intuitively. We don't even think about them. We could veer a little bit to the left to minimize harm for ourselves, but as a result, we may endanger a cyclist or somebody in the other lane. Or we could veer a little bit to the right, minimizing the harm for the cyclist or risk to the cyclist, but potentially endangering ourselves. And I think this is a morally charged situation, because it will determine the balance of risk. And in fact, it's not just hypothetical. This is a patent filed by Google. Actually, it was awarded in 2015, in which they describe precisely these sorts of scenarios. That the car is sitting behind a truck that is stuck for some reason, and it's assessing whether it should go around it. And they have this actual table in the patent filing, where, as you can see, a risk penalty is calculated for all sorts of things, like the current, losing information, has a particular risk magnitude and a probability of happening, which will then give you basically an expected penalty, right, or expected negative utility from this action. Getting hit from behind is another thing, And you can imagine that these things would come from actuarial tables. These come from, ultimately from liability, right? They somehow trickle back into the decision-making of the car. And I think that makes it extremely real, right? That these numbers will be computable very soon because there will be fleets, of cars learning from each other and all sorts of statistics being aggregated. So even though it's not the trolley problem as such, in this kind of very binary situation, there are, for every decision, and maybe millions of decisions every microsecond, every second, right, the car is making, will have a bearing on these kind of risks. And also, we've been doing things like this before. Even though the trolley problem is fundamentally unsolvable, we've been solving kind of these sorts of dilemmas already in the design of products and services, right? But also in the design of features of the car. So for example, this thing, I'm going to call it the moose bar dilemma. It's the dilemma of whether to ban the moose bar at the front of the car. In the UK, a study showed that it has disproportionate impact on risk to pedestrians and cyclists and people in other cars. And even though they're safe, it makes the car safer for the occupant. And as a result, these things have been banned in the UK, in Australia, in many European countries. Not in the US, not in Canada, as far as I know. So this is a decision about the trolley problem-like trade-off, right, that we're facing. And that different countries, different jurisdictions have made different decisions about, right, different calls about. So the question is, if the same trade-off takes place as a result of a software feature, as a behavioral feature of the car, then we wouldn't even know that it's happening unless we were looking, right? And this is the question, and I think this is what makes people so terrified of being in a car that may make decisions that risk them. So that was the too simple or astronomically rare sort of question or not technically feasible objection. And then we have it's too early to worry about it. And I would say that it would be nice if we didn't have to worry about it. But it seems that consumer adoption and regulation as well will be influenced by by these questions, moral questions, and maybe even investment that goes into it, into the technology. So to give you an example, last year, somebody from Mercedes-Benz made the following statement to a journalist in which was published in Car and Driver magazine. And he said, Christopher Hugo said, save the one in the car. And it was kind of taken a little bit out of context, but essentially that's the sentence, right? It was said exactly this way, and it was immediately taken out of context. And global tabloids started accusing Mercedes of killing children, even though there was no mention of children, but it does follow from the statement, right? Save the one in the car. OK, so you mean regardless of who's being saved or who's being sacrificed. And this is not good communication strategy, right? It's not good marketing. So they quickly had to retract. They had to clarify that what we will do is implement the legal framework and also what's socially acceptable, but we don't know what that is. So the law is still lagging behind, and our understanding of what's socially acceptable is still lagging behind as well. More recently, of course, Bill Ford and other people, kind of leaders from industry, have been emphasizing the importance of these questions and also kind of recognizing that they are ethical questions. They're not just legal questions. They're not something that you can just fix using liability laws with some sort of optimization of incentives, economic incentives. There is a question about the underlying values you're trying to maximize, right? Is it acceleration of the technology, so you want to improve investment in it? Is it minimizing backlash from the public, and so on? And even former President Barack Obama spoke about this to Joey Ito, the director of the Media Lab, in an interview that was published in Wired. And again, it's a moral decision who's setting those rules. So this led the regulators to also take these questions very seriously, like the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. These ethical considerations are essential, but there is no consensus and there are no metrics to evaluate against, right? And this is kind of the gap that we have now. So I want to take this also apart quickly before we get into the results and the research that we've been doing. And the reason is because I think this is it's an interesting question about whether doing behavioral science sometimes can be harmful, right? Like in terms of promoting or raising in people's minds an awareness of particular risks that they may not have thought about before. And actually, we did this. We took this very seriously, this objection. There was actually a philosopher earlier this year in a conference came to me after a panel and accused me, pointed at me and said, "You're killing people, you're by doing this research because you're scaring them away." And actually, we did the studies, and we did. First of all, we did correlational studies about prior exposure to the dilemma and whether it predicts, people's levels of excitement or willingness to purchase autonomous vehicles. And we realized, if anything, observationally, it's predictive of enthusiasm for the technology, not fear of the technology. But then we did controlled exposure. So we actually exposed people. We assigned people to conditions in which they were exposed to the dilemma, and other people they were not exposed to the dilemma. And then we asked them about their excitement and fear. And we have fairly strong evidence for a null hypothesis. So the exposure to the dilemma does not actually impact people's enthusiasm about the cars. It doesn't scare them away. And we found that this is robust, even in the case of, even if you limit yourselves to the samples of people who've never heard of the dilemma before, ever. So I think this is good for us. It shows that we're not doing harm by doing the research. So now let's move to the research and the social dilemma. So the first question that we were interested in is, well, what do people want those cars to do? And what cars would they like to buy? And in a paper that was published last year, we found the following, which is kind of the summary of the paper. I would never purchase a car that might sacrifice me, but I want everybody else to do so. So this kind of conflict between what you think is the right thing to do and what you would be willing to contribute yourself towards. And it's kind of summarized in this figure. As you can see here, this is the budget share for morality of the sacrifice, whether you want this in other people's cars and whether you want it in your car. And of course, whether you're killing a pedestrian to save 10, or even killing the passenger to save 10, of course, it's always, or killing a pedestrian to save 1, right? So killing a pedestrian to save 10, sure, right? That's moral. I want it in my car. I'm happy to kill pedestrians to save more pedestrians, right? That's easy. And I'm happy for other people to have it in their cars too. But then once you look at killing the passenger to save 10, then it's moral, kind of happy for it to be in other people's cars, but definitely not in mine, right? Now, so we started from the ethical dilemma, and then what we realized the real question was, or the real challenge was the social dilemma, is how do we get people to contribute to purchase the cars that will actually minimize total harm, rather than selfishly act in a way that will maximize their own safety. It looks like the tragedy of the commons, right? The public good here is public safety, and your small, tiny contribution to the public good is getting a car that may, in a very rare circumstance, increase risk to yourself slightly. But no one wants to do that, and as a result, we want to maximize safety. So how do we solve the public good dilemmas or tragedy of the commons? We regulate, right? So you have some sort of government regulator or community-based regulation where you set things like quotas on the number of sheep that you're allowed to graze or the number of, the amount of fish you can catch. And we ask people about regulation. And what's fascinating is that, fine, it's moral, but people did not support the regulation of behavior that will sacrifice the occupant, the passenger in the car. And what's interesting is that if it is regulated, people won't purchase it, right? So they were much more likely to purchase a car if it's not regulated to self-sacrifice. So basically, people are not willing to opt into this social contract that maximizes social welfare. Right? Of course, we can force everyone to do this, but essentially, people are saying no regulation of machines, of pro-social ethical behavior in machines, which I think is a bit of a problem, especially if people get to choose to stay with the current system, right? Like they can choose to continue to drive their cars themselves. So we started from the ethical dilemma. We realized it's a social dilemma. And then we realized if you solve the social dilemma the traditional way, people won't opt into the cars, won't purchase the cars. And as a result, more people would die along the way because people will continue to drive and text and get drunk and run traffic lights, red traffic lights and so on. So we don't have an answer yet, but I think we have some kind of diagnosis of where this is heading. Unless you can ban the cars that we have today all at once and then have everybody transition at the same time, then we're going to have this problem, right? We may actually be better off doing a bait and switch where people get first your safety is maximized, so people will opt into the cars, and then eventually you tune it, you tweak the algorithms and the regulations so that you gain all of those final, these marginal benefits at the end. Okay, so that was the first paper. Since then, on Mass Ave, actually, this was just after the paper appeared or before the paper appeared. Azim, myself, and Jean-Francois were sitting in a flour bakery on Mass Ave, and Azim made the suggestion, maybe we should have people make these decisions, themselves, and maybe design their own dilemmas so that they can kind of get a richer engagement with this topic. So we actually did that. We designed the Moral Machine, which some of you, I hope, are familiar with already. But essentially, it's a website that generates random ethical dilemmas faced by autonomous vehicles. They're always binary. It's always forced choice. But we have now much richer comparisons than the original trolley problem. We vary the ages and the genders and the species of the victims. We vary whether they're crossing legally or illegally. We also vary whether you're comparing passengers with pedestrians or two groups of pedestrians. And we calculated it once, and it was something like 26 million possible comparisons that you can make. So these are some of the dimensions that we randomized. For instance, and this is actually from the summary page that we show people at the end so that they learn something about themselves in comparison with others. For instance, we vary the number of people being killed in different outcomes. We vary the gender, the species, the social value, or if you like, social status, age, fitness even. We also vary whether people are upholding the law or not. And also, obviously, we're randomizing what's in the omission versus the commission case. So thanks to New York Times and also some media coverage, but also some YouTubers who have like 50 million followers because there's this whole subculture of people playing games and other people watching them on YouTube. So thanks to these people, including Jacksepticeye and PewDiePie as well, we got substantial attention to the website, like lots of traffic. We translated it to 10 languages. We have almost 4 million visitors to the site. We've collected leading up to 40 million decisions from people worldwide. And we have over 500,000 full surveys, which are optional, that people can fill at the end, where they give us their age and gender and other demographics, income brackets, and so on. So I don't know if it is the largest, but I think it is at least one of the largest moral psychology experiments ever conducted as a result, kind of inadvertently. At some point, we had 150 decisions per second, especially after the viral spikes, which got the computer science students very, very stressed at the time. So now I want to talk a little bit about the results. So before I show the aggregate results, I wanted to give some examples. In this case, we have two people in the car. If the car continues, it will kill those two people. But if the car swerves, it would kill two pedestrians. So how many people here, I'm interested in, with a show of hands, how many people would swerve? How many people would stay? You'll have to choose. OK. So indeed, more people would go straight, right? Because all else being equal, let's punish the people in the car. But not everybody agrees on that. Some people say the car has an obligation to its occupants, for example. OK, this is the situation where if the car continues, it would kill a child. But if it swerves, it would kill an adult. How many people would swerve now? Almost everyone. How many people would stay? Most people would swerve. And I would say I was presenting this in Australia, and there was an economist in the audience, and he said basically the marginal, the investment, the social value in the child, there's less sunk cost in the case of the child, so that's why it's utility maximizing to save the adult. Now let's go to the third scenario. In this case, how many people would swerve to kill the jaywalker and protect the legal crosser? OK, so that's an act of commission, right? So you're willing. OK, great. And then how many people would stay? OK, some. But I would say, yeah, more people would swerve. Most people actually would swerve. So recently, Azim and I ran this with a major car company as CEO and board in Germany. And in Germany, that number was even higher. It was like 85 or close to 90%. Now, what happens when there's two people? So now we're pitting the punishment of the jaywalkers versus utility maximizing or welfare maximizing outcome. So how many people would swerve now? Some. And people are also not lifting all the way up. It's kind of half a lift. And indeed, more people are now confused, right? So it's more like 50-50. So what we did now is we actually estimated the effects of all of these factors using causal inference techniques. And this is essentially these are all the factors. And this is the bias in favor of the choice on the right side. So we engineered this so that it's all positive. So, so basically, this is the change in probability. So if you switch, for example, an elderly person with a younger person, this is the average marginal treatment effect, right, of really there's a baseline probability of saving the elderly, and we just align them here to kind of to make the relative size of the effect more salient. And you can see that there is a preference for inaction, but it's fairly small. It's actually overshadowed by the other preferences. There's also a small preference for sparing pedestrians, sparing women over men. It's also preferences in this direction, and so on. And you can see that utilitarianism, or sparing more characters. So this is, if there's one more person on one side, or two more people, or three or four, you can see that utilitarian, and the average effect is actually coincides with this. So this is sparing more characters is a fairly important thing. Also, age, sparing young people is a fairly strong factor, and sparing humans obviously over animals is fairly strong. Now, let's contrast this with the world's first ethical guidelines for autonomous vehicles, which were published a couple of months ago by a commission in Germany, which was formed by the Federal Ministry of Transportation. The commission consisted of people from all walks of life, so they had legal and ethical ethicists, legal professors, engineers, representatives of industry, consumers, automobile clubs, so car lovers and so on, religious community, as well as the law, right? And this is good question. Very good question. Clearly, they were going for the normative, right? Yeah. This is what they came up with. So they published their guidelines, and recently the Minister of Transportation said that they will implement those guidelines. And I'll just show you some examples. Obviously, try not to have these situations arise in the first place. I would say this is wise. But also, you cannot distinguish based on any personal characteristics, including age. And we've seen that age is actually a very strong factor in people's judgments. So we may very well say, this is what we go with. That's what the Constitution says. But then we'll have to be prepared for the backlash, right? When multiple children die as a result. Another interesting thing is that programming to reduce the number of personal injuries may be justifiable. So utilitarianism is not mandated, but it's permitted. And I think it's interesting why they made that choice, and I can't tell, I don't know exactly why, but that's also another thing that was fairly strong in terms of effect sizes. And finally, parties involved in the generation of the risk must not sacrifice non-involved parties. Now, we have preference that suggests that people do believe, do have a values kind of similar to this. If you're in the car, you're less likely to be spared. If you are jaywalking, you're less likely to be spared, and so on. But I would say it's not as binary, right? The preference would be weighted against other things. Now, what we did, so I think this just highlights that there's a disconnect between the normative and the descriptive. But I think there's also another interesting thing, which is that this is Germany, right? And Germans have a particular way of thinking about the law and thinking about the public good. And this is not universal. So for us, because we had such a large data set, we were able to compute effect sizes for every country separately. And I'm going to show you now some of the results. We've computed the effect sizes. In some countries, they were stronger. In other countries, they were weaker. They were always in the same direction, but there was some variation. Now, we then clustered the countries. So if you take the, if we go back to, actually, yeah. So if you take the effect sizes as a vector, basically. It's like a 9-dimensional vector of all of the different factors. You could then apply basic hierarchical clustering techniques to bunch up countries that are more similar to each other. So you compute a Euclidean distance or something between those vectors. And here we're superimposing them on, you can see there's 3 clusters, one major cluster here, the green one, and then the purple one. This is for countries for which we have at least 1,000 respondents. And let's zoom a little bit on this. And this is superimposed on the Inglehart-Welzel cultural map, which is an old kind of way of classifying cultures to Catholic, Protestant, Islamic, and so on. And if you zoom in, you can see some really fascinating things like, for instance, English-speaking countries or like ex-Commonwealth, including ex-Commonwealth countries, all bunch up together, kind of more similar within this large cluster, this orange cluster. You also notice how Protestant Europe is kind of closer to each other. If you look at this purple cluster, you see that Southeast Asian countries and those that have Confucian origins or moral values are also bunched up together. Again, it's a little, obviously it's a little noisy. And finally, this green cluster has a lot of South American countries. Now, if you take each of these clusters and then compute the z-score of the effect sizes along different dimensions, you can see interesting things. So for example, you can see here that the purple cluster, which is predominantly Eastern, has a stronger preference for inaction. So these are z-scores of the effect sizes. So preference for inaction is stronger in the Eastern countries. It's weaker in the predominantly Western countries, even weaker in predominantly Southern countries. Relation to autonomous vehicles, there's a bit of variation here, but maybe not the most interesting. But like, look at sparing the lawful. It's fairly strong in Eastern countries, as well as Western countries, but weaker in Southern countries, like South America. South American preference for humans over animals is weaker as well. Like, they seem to be more interested in animal welfare, perhaps. And also utilitarianism, as you would expect, Western countries are the highest, right? The z-scores for those, for the countries in that cluster is the highest. Because ultimately, utilitarianism was invented in the West. So we're able to then take the US, which is where a lot of these technologies are going to be first invented, and then compute the distance from the US for each country, again, using these effect sizes. And you can see what you would expect. Sort of a lot of the countries in the same cluster are close. You can see Canada, Australia, Great Britain being closer, Sweden and Ireland and so on. And there are interesting correlates of these things. So for instance, so this is the distance in the moral machine data. And this is the cultural distance from the US using the World Values Survey. You can see there's an interesting correlation there. So there's a sense of there's an external validity, I think supported here, as well as genetic distance from the US seems to correlate strongly with the moral machine distance. And this is actually robust also for controlling for geography, which I think is really fascinating. Individualism also predicts things like preference for inaction, preference for sparing the young. So individualistic countries more likely to spare young people. Collectivist countries, they care about the extended family and older people and wisdom and whatnot. And then sparing more characters as well. So individualistic countries are more utilitarian as well. We also have the rule of law being predictive of sparing the lawful, as you would expect, and also of utilitarianism. Rule of law also predicts sparing more humans. And you can see the clusters here are really nicely bunched up together, and sparing people with higher status. And this is, for me, this was really interesting, that countries with a stronger rule of law actually with a weaker rule of law, had stronger preference for sparing higher status people. And I think this may be due to some self-selection bias. So there were, in countries which have lower rule of law, people who have access to the internet, who are interested in autonomous cars, are probably going to be more higher status in relative terms in those societies, and they're obviously sparing themselves. So I want to quickly, I had a skip button here in case we needed to go fast, but I'm happy to cover it. So we'll skip, okay. So that's okay. So just completely separately, we're doing some work on how people assign blame and responsibility to the human and the car company under different automation regimes. So in an autopilot where the car drives, but you have to watch, versus a guardian angel where you drive and the car watches and can intervene, versus a fully autonomous cars. And then we're noticing some really interesting kind of anomalies around the way that people assign blame to different parties. But that's happy to talk about this in the break. So I'll press the skip button and just go straight to acknowledge my collaborators. So the social dilemma work, actually all of this work is in collaboration with Jean-Francois and Azim. The cross-cultural comparisons work we're doing now with Joe Henrich at Harvard, and Jonathan Schulz and a bunch of students in my lab. And the work on the automation regimes is work we're doing with Josh Tenenbaum and some people in his lab as well. So thank you. How do we manage questions? Do you?
Hi, Deirdre Milligan, Berkeley. So I have some questions about the way in which you've kind of tested whether or not people are picking up on the cues that you think are relevant. So I've used this as a design intervention in classes for about since it started, a year and a half now,
yeah.
Something like that. And what I've found super interesting is when we debrief with the students, one, there's students are very concerned about submitting anything through this for you to use to make these sorts of, right, they're like, right, because they're really concerned about whether or not they actually thought things through at the rigorous level. Some of them reject making decisions based on traits, right, and so they're super concerned. But very few of them note the lights, they don't note the crosswalks, right? So the questions of legality that get pulled out, very few of them even recognize those things. Pretty routinely, people think that there's distinctions between whether people are fat or pregnant, whether they're fit or fat. People ask questions, they assume that I think what you intend to be robbers are bankers. Some of them want to kill all the bankers. So there's like a whole range of assumptions in the design about how people are actually perceiving what you're trying to foreground, and I'm wondering how you've tested that, because it's been super interesting to me, the way in which they don't pick up on things that I think there's an assumption are important inputs, or they confuse visual signals that I think you're trying to convey. So I'd love to hear some conversation about that.
Okay.
And it's been super useful, though.
Thank you. Well, first, I think these are all valid points. I think this is us. It was important for us to establish external validity of the results. Like, for example, when we compare the distance in the moral machine to cultural distance on the World Values Survey, I think then we know that we're picking up some a signal that is real because it got other correlates. There's some sort of convergent validity here. The other thing is that I think when you present whether it's textual or visual, you're always going to have this problem, right? So you're always going to have the problem of people bringing in their own perspectives on the world in the way they interpret the intervention or the treatment. And I don't think you could avoid that. Now you could do a better or a worse job, right? But I think this is where this external validity and correlations that we've observed with other things. And there's also like a face validity from just seeing how the countries bunch up together, right? That these things are indeed part of the same culture. So there's something that we're picking up on. Now, of course, the design itself is not endorsing any particular comparison as important. We're trying to be descriptive. We're trying to see, do people think that a larger person, for example, should not be as equally protected, for instance. That's not to endorse this comparison, but it's to show that, we're holding a mirror, right, to society to see itself. And some countries are saying, well, this is unconstitutional, and this is against the law, and we will mandate that this information isn't used. Yeah. Yes, we did a lot of user-centered design, exactly, initially, and we noticed, there was a point where we noticed that people were not paying as much attention or early enough to the traffic signals, and we made them larger, and there was a lot of iteration. It looks kind of simple and cartoonish, but that was a result of a lot of iteration. It looked really ugly initially. Yeah, so we tried our best, and I think the effects are being picked up, right? We're able to estimate them, and I think that for me also the more important thing is the directionality. So it's what economists wouldn't be interested in the exact effect size; they would be interested in the comparative static, right? That things move in this direction when you vary this. Now, to the extent to which it moves, maybe if you made the cartoons cuter, then you'll have a slightly greater or slightly smaller effect size, but it's always going to be moving in one direction.
But now you also have the text description.
That's right. That's right. Thank you, Mia. So we do have a textual description, and actually we repeated the analysis with a subset of scenarios or samples in which people have pressed those buttons to better understand what's going on, and you get very similar results.
I think we have time for one more, and then we'll.
Okay.
Hello? Oh, there we go. Adam Ghazali from UCSF. I was wondering, and I apologize if I missed this, but how decisions vary given timing and emotional intensity. So if you have time to think about it and debate it versus you're put in a simulation where you have to make the decision within milliseconds, do these map onto each other or not?
So some people have done work in kind of virtual reality. I think some group from Germany did work on that, and where they varied the time given to people. And I think people just obviously there's a speed at which you just start acting randomly. But when people have less time, they try and avoid whatever is in front of them. I think. I think they were also more utilitarian. I think intuition favors pro-social behavior. But I think there's a limit to the applicability of these results to the companies like Google or Ford, because they have the time to think about it. So in our case, people have as much time as they need to think about the scenarios. We don't give them. There's no counter or anything like that. But we did in separate work we're doing with Josh Tenenbaum now. Actually, we're building basically a probabilistic model of decision making in these dilemmas, and we're finding that when the dilemmas are easy, the decision is made quicker because we actually do record time taken to make every single decision. And when the dilemmas are more difficult, when the utilities, as inferred by us, are closer, then people take longer.
I was thinking about the real world situation of semi-autonomous cars, where the car is doing a lot of the work, but you, as the human, would be pushed to actually make some of these decisions with seconds. And if people would just make very different decisions than they would make given time.
Yeah, I think it's interesting for these cases. In this case, we're assuming for full autonomy, but I do think there are all sorts of interesting variations with the partial autonomy, which is why we're studying some other aspects of it too.
All right, well, great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.